deep enough into witnessing and observe the function of ego, and you'll discover that it's just continually running reactive loops.
We don't experience reality as it really is. We perceive it through a filter that allows us to see only what we've been conditioned to see. That's because we've become trapped in the neurobiology of our own brain. Just like every tree has a unique set of branches, every brain has a unique pattern of neurons and connections that are both genetic and learned over time. So each and every one of us is wired differently. And it's the neural architecture of our brains that tells us who we are and how we're going to act and react in the world.
Every thought we have is the result of a network of hundreds of billions of brain cells called neurons. Unlike other cells in our bodies, neurons don't touch each other, but are separated by microscopic spaces called synapses. Neurons communicate across these synapses through chemical transfers that blast from one cell to the next with a zap of electricity. Messages zip around our brain like a supersonic pinball machine. Each neuron sends and receives information to 50,000 other neurons in a rapid-fire production that all adds up to 100 billion neurons times 50,000 connections. In fact, there are more connections between neurons in a single human brain than there are stars in our galaxy. The result is a complex neural forest of networks that form our personality, our identity, and our habits. Hardly ever do we find trees that grow alike, and we don't find brains that grow alike. We are all unique. While these trillions of neuron networks often work in concert to create brainstorms of creativity and new ideas, their primary purpose is to keep each and every one of us alive and safe by recognizing patterns as they access a constantly changing environment. But sometimes things get stuck.
Who of us doesn't have some form of addictive behavior or another?
Maybe for personal comfort or because of a desire or whatever is behind it, and changing them is very difficult for a lot of people, and they struggle with that, and so a lot of them are stuck in old routines, old patterns.
Eventually, we become stuck in these patterns and live our lives on autopilot, essentially becoming more and more mindless as we continue to view the world through filters instead of seeing things as they really are. As we grow older, our actions and reactions become conditioned by our hopes, our intentions, anxieties, motivations, loves, hates, desires, fears, or frustrations. Thus, we analyze before we experience, and we filter before we see.
Explaining that in brain terms is not hard to understand. I've done it in a lot of my writing, which is we have habit centers in our brain. These habit centers in our brain roughly are shared with reptiles, and they are very unconscious. So you literally do get into behavioral loops that you're doing without being aware of it.
Our perception operates increasingly like a defense mechanism, trapping us in patterns of behavior that have less to do with present reality and more to do with past experience or expectations.
But if we start changing that neural architecture through intentionally paying attention to what's here in a particular way, then we start training that healthy reactivity, that more adaptive reactivity that can help us with stress, anxiety, depression, trauma, and even addiction.
As long as we continue to perceive reality as we've been conditioned to perceive it, we're destined to live a life in endless reactive loops of conditioned responses.
Mindfulness changes your relationship with that habit center so that it's not in control in anything like the same degree.
By noticing the looping that happens in any particular moment, that reactive looping, that's sending us into these states of suffering.
But if you practice mindfulness once or twice daily, you'll be able to change your brain physiology, and you'll be able to change your nervous system.
Even 8 minutes or more a day can grow measurable neural structure.
So anything in the brain that is changing and being retained is through some kind of neuroplasticity. And again, it's not rewiring major pathways, it's changing the subtle connectivity of the pathways that exist.
So neuroplasticity changes the brain from being more centered in primary emotion, the kind of emotion that we share with all the other mammals, to the executive centers of the brain.
We do form new neurons and new connections. So when we practice mindfulness, we develop new circuits.
Neurons that fire together, wire together throughout the entire nervous system. They do so preferentially for what's in the field of focused attention.
The brain is more plastic even in adults than people realize. I mean, there is a lot of room for change in those habit loops, and it does not take that long.
So little mindfulness practices sustained over time can add up to big changes for the better over the course of your life.
The brain is plastic, and what it has learned, it can unlearn. So becoming mindful means untraining our brains, emptying them of preconceived patterns. This easily accessible ability releases us from constraints and quickly changes mindless behavior into mindful behavior. But what's more important is that mindfulness actually evolves the brain. It actually advances the evolutionary process of our brain to a state where we act in a wiser, more compassionate mode to not only ourselves, but to others and our global environment.